and welcome to my new podcast. My name is Lloyd Holiday, and the title of the podcast is The Cost of a Thing. Thanks for listening in today. So this podcast is going to be about the cost of things. Money. How much time it takes working to buy the things that you want, and especially how much time it takes working to buy the things that you need. All of this directly leads to your standard of living, how well you live, how well you're going to live in this world. That's your standard of living. Yes, standard of living. That is one of the most important things that determines our quality of life on this planet. So I'm going to discuss any issue that affects the United States standard of living. These may be government policies, trends, social changes, business, finance, employment, and other issues. And one thing in particular that I'm going to focus on is rip-offs. There are a lot of rip-offs going on right now in this country. Probably all of us know what some of these are. We see them going down, and they're going down right now as I speak. So I'm going to talk about why these rip-offs happen, how they happen, how they come about, and all the reasons why. Who's benefiting from these rip-offs and who's getting ripped off. So the first group of podcasts I'm going to do is each one is going to be on a big rip-off. And I want to start with what I think are the top 10 rip-offs going right now. And then there's more than 10, so I'm going to keep going and do as many as I have to cover all of the rip-offs. So the rip-offs. Probably all of us have been scammed by some of the rip-offs. And I think if we could moderate or end these rip-offs, well, most of us, our standard of living would go way up. And I've noticed something else about the standard of living over the past 50 years, since the 1960s and 70s, when the standard of living of the United States was probably at its highest ever. It's gone down from there. Today, the standard of living, in my opinion, is much lower than it was in the 60s and 70s. I grew up in the 1960s, and I know how it was. I watched my parents and how they lived their lives, and I watched the neighbors and friends and everybody else and how they lived. And I think they lived much better then, in general, than people today do. And I'm going to discuss how and why it was better in the 1960s and 70s, the standard of living, and how and why it's declined to where it is today. And of course, some of the main reasons for this are the rip-offs, and that's why I'm going to focus on those rip-offs, and I'm going to hammer those rip-offs all through my entire podcast here. So I want to make a very careful and clear comparison between that standard of living of the 1960s and the standard of living of today. So that even if you weren't here, you weren't alive yet, as the young people were not, that they can know what happened and why it was better then. And I'm sure many young people have already heard stories from their parents and grandparents about how it was easier for them to raise their families and start their households back in the 1960s and 70s. And maybe they think it's harder for the younger people today. Well, I'm here to tell you it is harder for the younger people to start a household and raise families today than it was back in the 1960s. If you're a young person, Generation X or Millennial, I want you to know what happened here. And you should know. And this is what I'm going to try to get across. And consider this for a minute. With all of the technological advantages of today that they did not have in the 1960s, better tools, better machines, better methods of building and manufacturing, better communications, computers, smartphones, way better electronics. Everything's more efficient nowadays. And with all of that, we're not living as well as they did in the 1960s. We should all be living better than they did in the 1960s with all of the new productivity gains and all these great technological advances. The young people today should have a much easier time starting a household and raising a family than they did back then. But it isn't, is it? Why and how all of this has happened is one of the main reasons that I'm doing these podcasts. I want especially the young people to understand all this and what's happened here. And also, I don't want all of this to be forgotten. That it was better in the 60s than it is now. And I don't want it to be forgotten and buried and erased. I want it out there, and I want it being discussed, and I want it changed. Now, in doing these podcasts, I am not an anchorman with a degree in anchorology or whatever those anchormen have. My background is in electrical engineering, and I have a Bachelor's of Science degree in electrical engineering. And I hope to be able to use the skills from that, the skills of research, analysis, and logic, to get to the heart of the matter of these issues that I'm going to be presenting and discussing here. So I don't have a large editing crew or a graphics crew or a studio. It's just me and my computer and my ideas. And I wouldn't want the strings attached to all that anyway, because that means you're going to have to say what they tell you to say and, not say what they don't want you to say. And I don't want that. And I think most of us know that a lot of the news nowadays is basically just a propaganda outlet. I don't want any of that either. And basically, I don't want to spend too much time doing a lot of editing, and I'll try to spend most of my time on content. So if I make a mistake, well, that's just going to be the way it is. What I think the news should be is to tell us the news. What happened? Unbiased. And of course, that's not what we're getting. And what I want to do here is the opposite of what the news is doing. And I want to tell the truth, as far as I know it, and what happened. I have no agenda. Nobody's paying me to do this. Nothing else matters to me but to get the truth as I know it across to the listener. as clearly as I can. And that's what I hope that I can accomplish here on these podcasts. And I hope that the Cost of a Thing podcast will become and stand as a record of how things were economically in the 1960s as compared to how they are today. So that doesn't get lost. Finally, as I wrap up this introduction to the Cost of a Thing podcast, I'd like to introduce you to my novel of the same name, The Cost of a Thing. Now that's not a coincidence that they have the same title, because the issues that the characters in the novel face are many of the same ones I'm going to present here on the Cost of a Thing podcast. Because I think these are the most important issues affecting our standard of living today here in the United States. And I don't think these issues are discussed enough or at all in many cases. And I think they need to be discussed a lot more and not just swept under the rug and forgotten about and ignored the way I believe the government and probably the media also seem to be doing. These are the most important issues of our time. These issues are so important to me that they're one of the main things that inspired me to write this novel and also to do this podcast. There on the screen is the cover of the novel I wrote, The Cost of a Thing. The story in the novel is about 2 generations of a fictional American family. The first generation raises its children in the 1960s. Then their children, who are the next generation, raise their kids in the 2000s. As the story unfolds, you can see the characters live out the economic decline of the United States and its consequences. A lot like plenty of Americans are doing today. And you can see the contrast between the economic fortunes of these 2 generations. And that's what I'm really trying to show here. And even though this book is fiction, my aim here was to take the reader back in my time machine, sort of, and let them experience life as I knew it in the 1960s and in the other times in which the book is set. And that's all I'm going to say about that right now, as I'm going to do a much more detailed summary of the book and do some more commenting and insights on it in a later podcast here in a couple of weeks. So if you're if that's something you'd be interested in to take a look at, look for that podcast. I'll call it Summary of the Novel, The Cost of a Thing, and or something like that. And my next podcast will be, I will start doing, the rip-offs one at a time, one podcast per rip-off, and I'll talk about those in as great a detail as I can and get those out there. And I'll start with the top 10, which I think are the top 10 worst rip-offs. And if you're interested, you can see the Amazon link to my book, The Cost of a Thing. If you want to find out some more information about it, there is more information there at the Amazon link. Thank you for listening in today. And until next time, this is Lloyd Holiday signing off.